Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Stay with me until the end and share your thoughts. A single, worn-out hand fumbled gently inside a synthetic purse, the cheap fabric rubbing against the leather lining of a luxury car seat. Inside, nestled amongst old receipts and lint, were a few metallic coins, $5, to be exact. The camera holds tight on this small, desperate inventory, then pulls back sharply to reveal the blinding, neon-lit facade of the Monarch, a high-end downtown bistro, a beacon of unreachable wealth. This disparity was the defining feature of Elara's life, existing in the shadow of opulence, always close enough to touch the glass, but never to step through it. The harsh overhead lights of the bistro mirrored the cold clarity of her situation. A woman in her early 30s, worn out by 2 shifts of relentless cleaning, trying to stretch a life out of scarcity. Her exhaustion was a visible thing, etched into the lines around her eyes, yet she carried herself with a silent, unbroken dignity. Elara wasn't just working, she was sacrificing, making every hour count for the one person who mattered, her son. Her silent suffering was a universal language, spoken in every city where wealth and poverty shared the same concrete. Across town, Veronica, a woman in her 40s whose name was synonymous with sharp business deals and expensive jewels, sat at a polished mahogany table in her office. Her world was a fortress of control, yet her eyes held a hollow, almost ghost-like quality. The diamonds on her wrist, while sparkling under the controlled lighting, seemed less like ornaments and more like shackles, heavy reminders of a success built on a foundation of professional frigidity and profound, intimate solitude. Veronica was externally powerful, but internally, she was a fractured mirror reflecting a painful past. Tonight, Elara allowed herself a small, crucial break. She was at a mid-range cafe, one of those slightly pretentious places where the middle class went to feel a little more. She was there with her partner, trying to make the $5 buy a shared dinner and a semblance of normalcy. This small act of seeking comfort, this one fleeting moment of vulnerability in the harsh routine, was about to be obliterated not by fate, but by the casual cruelty of an unexpected public humiliation. That pain, the type that burns the very soul, was about to change 2 lives forever, an intersection of worlds brought together by 5 small coins. Veronica rarely left her bubble, but tonight, business demanded it. She sat at a corner table in the same cafe, flanked by 2 sharp-suited colleagues discussing cold, hard figures. The conversation was distant, muffled, a backdrop to her own internal monologue. She looked every bit the successful businesswoman, poised, expensive, utterly detached. Yet, the subtle but distinct metallic sound of coins scattering on a nearby tabletop managed to pierce through the hum of her professional facade, a sound so raw and out of place that it momentarily seized her attention. The silence that followed the clatter was more deafening than any shout. Elara's partner, frustration boiling over into venomous public display, had thrown the few coins back at her. "That's what you bring to the table? $5? Your burden, Elara." A heavy, exhausting burden. His words were a low, vicious hiss, but their impact was seismic. Elara didn't look up. She didn't retaliate. She only tried to collect the meager, scattered wealth, her body folding into a posture of shame and profound exhaustion, wishing the floor would swallow her whole. Veronica's gaze, previously vacant, snapped into sharp, unforgiving focus. She watched Elara's trembling fingers reach for the scattered dimes and quarters. This wasn't just a domestic dispute. It was a surgical strike against human dignity. For a second, Elara's averted face, framed by the unforgiving light, seemed to trigger a deep, almost instinctual recognition in Veronica, a flash of a former self, equally desperate, equally invisible. The air thickened. Elara's shame was palpable, a physical presence at the table. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, finally lifted and met Veronica's across the crowded room. It was only a fraction of a second, but in that moment, the unspoken dialogue of 2 women who had intimately known what it meant to fight for survival was exchanged. Elara's look wasn't one of recognition, but of exposure, the crushing weight of her reality laid bare for the elite to observe. Veronica's colleague, noticing her frozen stare, gave her a dismissive, sharp nudge. "Don't look, Veronica. It's trashy drama. Not our problem. Let's finish this deal." But the command fell on deaf ears. Veronica's polished exterior had a microscopic crack. Elara, still on her hands and knees, whispered to her partner with a voice thick with defeat, "Please, not here." The simplicity and quietness of that plea were more powerful than any outburst, anchoring Veronica to the spot. The climax of the small, terrible scene arrived when a busboy, acting on a hasty, whispered instruction from Elara's partner, approached a devastated woman. He didn't offer help. He pointed discreetly towards the door. "Ma'am, you're causing a disturbance. You need to leave." The collective, silent judgment of the room descended upon Elara, accusing her not of poverty, but of inconvenience. She finally stood, leaving the 5 coins where they lay, choosing dignity over the small amount of cash, and began the walk of shame, leaving behind her a bewildered and utterly changed Veronica. Veronica sat rigid, the expensive Chardonnay now tasting like ash. Her colleagues continued their conversation, oblivious to the emotional grenade that had just detonated feet away. "It's not your problem, Veronica. It never is." The voice of her past, the cold, pragmatic logic she had meticulously cultivated for decades, echoed in her mind. Her professional life had been built on a wall of non-involvement, but the image of Elara's trembling hand trying to gather those insignificant coins was already scaling that wall. She tried to rationalize it away. Just a poor choice of partner. A simple argument. But the way the light had caught Elara's face, that profound, soul-deep exhaustion, was a mirror of her own reflection years ago. A distant, forgotten memory surfaced. The smell of burnt toast in a tiny, one-room apartment. A scent of failure and hunger that had fueled her relentless ascent. The memory was an acid on her carefully constructed composure. Her hand instinctively went to the silver locket she always wore, a seemingly decorative piece that contained a faded, creased photograph of her own mother, a woman who had worked 3 menial jobs until she literally collapsed from exhaustion. "The world doesn't pity the weak, darling. It forgets them." Her mother's words, whispered on her deathbed, suddenly returned, heavy and meaningful, a personal commandment to never be weak again. The internal struggle was now visible. Her jaw was tight, her eyes darted between the door, where Elara had vanished, in her own sleek, silent phone. Her mind raced with excuses. Intervening is messy. It's charity. It's a weakness. But beneath the cold logic, the image of the 5 coins, symbols of a desperate fight for survival, was a direct challenge to the very meaning of her own hard-won wealth. A sudden, jarring impulse took over. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving swiftly with a decisive coldness that masked the emotional turmoil. She sent a cryptic text to Marcus, her sharp, discreet assistant, along with a rough photo of Elara she had managed to capture subtly. "Quick check. Local cleaner. 2 shifts. Find out her stressor. Priority." It wasn't an act of benevolence yet. It was an investigation, a search for the proof she needed to either dismiss the emotion or validate it. While waiting, she tried to force herself back into the business meeting, forcing a sterile smile and nodding at the figures. But the coffee suddenly tasted metallic, like the coppery taste of blood, or perhaps the sound of the fallen coins. She could hear the murmur of the other customers, the casual indifference of the cafe, and it all felt profoundly wrong. A symphony of privilege ignoring suffering. Minutes later, a notification buzzed, a small, discreet tremor against the polished wood of the table. Marcus had replied. The information was concise, professional, and devastating. Elara's name, her address, her schedule, and then the crucial final line: primary stressor. Recent and ongoing debt from son's unexpected hospital stay. The corporate language only amplified the tragedy. Then, the final, undeniable proof arrived. A photograph. Marcus, efficient as ever, had cross-referenced the name with community health records. It was a clear, unvarnished image. Elara, not in her work uniform, but in a simple, faded t-shirt, sitting exhausted beside a bed in a stark community hospital wing, her small son, pale but smiling, asleep beside her. The narrative of her struggle was now complete, transformed from vague poverty into a mother's concrete, desperate fight against a cruel system. Veronica stared at the image on her phone, the boy's small, vulnerable hand clutching his mother's tired arm. The picture was an irrefutable piece of evidence, a silent witness to Elara's sacrifice. This wasn't a choice. It was a war waged for family, a conflict Veronica intimately understood. The cold, analytical wall she had built around her heart began to crumble, not from a flood of empathy, but from a calculated recognition of genuine strength. Her colleagues were still arguing over profit margins, their voices now distant, almost absurd. Veronica saw the CCTV camera mounted high in the corner of the cafe, observing the entire cruel spectacle. She made another quick, quiet call, not to Marcus, but to a contact, a sharp, high-powered lawyer. "I need a witness statement and a full review of the service records from this venue right now," she commanded, her voice low but carrying the full weight of her executive authority. She was no longer just observing. She was gathering the tools of justice. Elara was gone, but the ghost of her humiliation lingered. Veronica pushed a photo toward her colleagues, who finally stopped talking, their faces a blend of confusion and annoyance. "You call that trashy drama," Veronica said, her voice cutting through the air. "I call it unrecognized commitment. That $5 wasn't for a trivial dinner. It was the last resort against a hospital bill." One colleague, embarrassed, scoffed, "So you're going to give her a handout?" "Veronica, we're negotiating a $1 billion contract. Get a grip." Veronica didn't look at him. She looked at the abandoned 5 coins on the table. "A handout is temporary. Dignity is permanent," she stated, her words a promise to herself, a final declaration against the cold philosophy she had once embraced. She abruptly stood up, leaving the negotiating table and the $1 billion deal completely, her high heels echoing with purpose on the marble floor. She went to Elara's empty table, pulling a clean white napkin from the dispenser. The 5 coins sat there, pathetic and powerful. She collected them, her hands surprisingly gentle. The irony of a millionaire handling $5 as if they were gold ingots was not lost on her. She saw the small, almost invisible wet patch where Elara's tears had fallen, a silent scar on the wood. Veronica knew charity was a balm, a temporary fix that often stripped the recipient of their pride. Elara didn't need a savior. She needed an equal chance. The thought sparked a brilliant, audacious idea rooted in her business acumen, leveraging Elara's very struggle into an opportunity. Veronica called Marcus again, this time dictating terms that were less about social work and more about a calculated, powerful investment. The lawyer called back quickly. The footage from the CCTV was clear. The busboy, instigated by the ex-partner, had been unequivocally rude, clearly violating the cafe's conduct policy. Veronica took the information, not to fire the boy, but to hold over the establishment. "Send the owner a contract proposal. I want a charity event here, next week, dedicated to single mothers in healthcare debt. Full pro bono sponsorship from my foundation." She was turning Elara's humiliation into a public statement, using her power to correct a social injustice. The next day, Veronica waited. She hadn't chased Elara. She had prepared the ground. Marcus, following instructions, located Elara during her second cleaning shift at a deserted downtown office building. He simply left a discreet, professional message, a proposal for Elara, not charity, investment. From Veronica, the silence of Elara's acceptance or refusal was the next test. The response arrived that evening. A short, simple text from Elara's burner phone. "Where and when? No questions. No thanks. Only pure, tired resolve." It was the answer of a woman who was done being a victim and ready to be a warrior. The meeting was set for a private room in Veronica's sterile corporate headquarters. The meeting was brief, almost silent. Elara, dressed in her best but still smelling faintly of cleaning solvent, stood facing Veronica. There were no pleasantries, only the weight of their shared history, one woman's present, the other's past. Veronica didn't apologize for seeing the humiliation. She acknowledged the strength. That $5. It was the strongest thing in that room, Veronica began, her voice unusually soft. Veronica didn't slide cash across the table. Instead, she presented a crisp, formal document, a memorandum of understanding for a small seed investment into a cooperative business idea, a specialized high-end cleaning service with fair wages and benefits that Elara had once dreamed of. The document was a symbol, not a loan, but a chance to earn the money back and build a company. Elara looked at the document, then at Veronica, searching for the trick. Alongside the contract, Veronica placed the 5 coins, cleaned and neatly stacked. And next to them, she placed the white napkin she had collected from the table, now bearing a single handwritten phrase in elegant script. For your strength, not for your debt. Elara finally broke, not into tears of sadness, but into a wave of cathartic, exhausted relief. The narrative now shifts rapidly. Elara accepts. The conflict is no longer external but internal. Can she actually pull this off? Veronica, acting as a silent mentor, demands only one thing. Elara must never forget the feeling of those 5 coins, using it as fuel, not as a chain. The last piece of the investigation is a subtle, silent pact between 2 women who recognize the power of dignity. The scene is months later, silent and intimate. Elara stands in a newly renovated, small office space, the headquarters of her fledgling cleaning cooperative, Dignity Services. The lights are soft, the air smelling of fresh paint and possibilities. She's wearing a professional, simple dress, her hair pulled back, but the fatigue is gone, replaced by a deep, centered calm. She is arranging files, an act of ownership she'd never known. She walks to the corner of the desk where a small, unassuming glass jar sits. It is the jar where she keeps the 5 original coins, polished now, a small, tangible anchor to her past. She gently picks up the white napkin with Veronica's bold, flowing script. For your strength, not for your debt. The phrase a mantra of her transformation. The moment is intensely silent. She closes her eyes, not in prayer, but in acknowledgement. She remembers the cold floor of the cafe, the heat of the humiliation, the shame that had nearly crushed her. She had come close to giving up, close to believing she was a burden. That shame was now a scar, a guidepost. In this silent act, the true emotional climax unfolds. She no longer sees the $5 as a representation of her lack, but as the currency of her resolve. She realizes Veronica didn't just give her money. She validated the struggle. The true investment wasn't in the business, but in Elara's belief in her own worth. She opens her eyes, and a decision is made. She walks to the small window, overlooking the bustling street below. She pulls out her own personal wallet, no longer a cheap purse, but a sturdy leather one. She takes out a single $50 bill, a large, crisp denomination, and places it, not back into her wallet, but into the glass jar next to the original coins. It is her first contribution to a future employee's dignity fund. This small, deliberate action, a reversal of the original shame, is the complete emotional point of no return. Elara is no longer resisting her new life. She is actively committing to the legacy of her own strength. She is healed, not by wealth, but by the dignity of choice. The silence of the office is finally broken, not by sound, but by the weight of a powerful, earned peace. The final scene cuts to a small, brightly lit apartment, warm and alive. It is Elara's new home. Her son, radiant and clearly healthy, is sitting at a small, proper desk, drawing with a focus he never had before. The air is no longer stale with worry, but smells faintly of a dinner that can be afforded. The difference is subtle. The boy isn't spoiled. He is simply secure. Elara enters the room, no longer stooped with the weight of 2 shifts, but standing tall. She pauses at the doorway, watching her son. She walks over to him, not to nag or rush him, but simply to embrace him. The hug is long, silent, and deep, a catharsis that speaks volumes of battles won not with fists, but with resilience. This embrace is the ultimate payoff, the silent reward for the fight. As she pulls back from the hug, the camera focuses on her hand, which is now resting on her son's shoulder. On her wrist, she wears no expensive jewelry, but a simple, almost utilitarian bracelet. It is a quiet symbol of her true value, a stark contrast to Veronica's earlier diamonds, showing that substance finally triumphed over surface. The video fades out with a final symbolic shot. It's a close-up of a small, polished wooden plaque on Elara's office wall, a gift from Veronica. It reads, "Dignity is not a gift, it is an investment." The story avoids the full explanation, trusting the viewer to understand that the true value of the contract was not the money it provided, but the self-respect it returned. If this story showed you that dignity is worth more than money, don't forget to like and share it with someone who needs hope today. Have you lived something like this? Tell us in the comments. Your story might help someone too. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. There's more to come.